Within days of Bank Negara raising interest rates by 0.25%, almost all Malaysian banks responded, hiking borrowing rates with immediate effect. But it was a one-way street as deposit or FD rates did not budge, or if they did, like in the case of RHB, by a smaller amount. Now, banks do this to protect what they describe as their net interest margins, which is the difference between their cost of funds, i.e. deposit rates or the interest they pay to us as depositors, and borrowing rates or the interest they charge us to borrow money to buy cars, houses, factories and land. And of course the banks will do this, right? Raise rates immediately because according to them, they've had a really tough 3.5 years, which is when Bank Negara last increased interest rates. But have they really had that hard a time? Let's take, say, 2016 as a sample period to see if bank earnings really did fall. And Maybank, which is the country's biggest bank, earnings were hardly dented in 2016. That year's revenue of 44.7 billion ringgit was nearly 5 billion ringgit higher than 2015. Net income of 6.7 billion ringgit was only marginally lower than the previous year's tally of 6.8 billion ringgit. At Public Bank, profits were even better. 2016 revenue of 20.1 billion ringgit was nearly a billion higher than 2015, while net profit came in at 5.2 billion ringgit, 140 million up on 2015. Now, Morningstar shows that operating margins at Public Bank that year were a staggering 67%, while Maybank's was still a pretty decent 38%. So what's my point? My point is this, that even in their so-called darkest hour, banks still made amazing profits. And now that the so-called tightening curve has begun, banks have immediately passed on the cost to the ordinary Joe, setting the tone for a period of even fatter bank profits. Now, the truth of the matter is this, that the last 10 years have been a terrible time for conservative investors. With interest rates so low and cash losing value every year to inflation, folks have been basically forced to buy something, anything, to make their money work for them. And the irony is that it was the greed of the bankers which forced this period of easy money on all of us in the first place, thanks to the global financial crisis of 2008, which saw central banks everywhere impose zero to low interest rates all over the world to jumpstart economies. Come to think of it, what exactly are central banks and whose purpose do they really serve? Because when you really think about it, central banks are perhaps even more powerful than the government, since they control the price and supply of money via monetary and fiscal policy.
Let's set up a game of Monopoly and you want to buy Park Place. What I can continually do is just print money, give myself more money, lower the value of your money by printing more. No matter how hardworking you are or how successful you are, I can always end up buying you for free.
Now, in America, the Federal Reserve has been criticized heavily for its close links to Wall Street, and specifically Goldman Sachs, with not one, not two, but 4 Fed presidents were ex-Goldman bankers. It's the same thing in Europe, with Mario Draghi, also a former Goldman's guy, and the Bank of England, with Governor Mark Carney, also a former Goldman Sachs banker. In Malaysia, Bank Negara governors have largely been B&M lifers, except for Tan Sri Ahmad Muhammad Dawn, who was a former Maybank CEO and MD. And again, what's my point? Well, it's pretty simple. My point is really a question. Whose interests do central banks really serve, and do they have too close a connection to big, powerful, rich banks?
Central banks are banking cartels which have gone into partnership with the respective governments in the countries where they operate. And they've been given monopolistic power over the creation of the nation's money supply. That's what the politicians handed to them as a gift, you might say, for the partnership. Now, in return, what did the bankers do for the politicians? They promised to create money out of nothing, now that they've got this legal power to do it anytime the government needs it.
And since 2008, we've witnessed the greatest fake money printing run in recorded history.
Now, it's still too early to assess the full impact of last month's rate hike, but if Malaysia's data holds up, and indications are that it will, then there's a good chance Bank Negara might hike one more time, at least before the year is up. And if they do, then it might get pretty hairy for some highly leveraged people and companies, which might then trigger a recession.
When the excess products created through the cheap money-induced investments reach the market, consumers are unable to buy them. At this point, the bust occurs. By manipulating interest rates, governments create bubbles.
One last point I'd like to make, and it's this. Throughout history, stupendous wealth has been made during times of crisis and recession. It is during these boom-bust periods that the rich and wealthy buy stuff on the cheap, helped of course by the big banks which lend them cheap money. Collateralized by their assets, the rich are able to buy even more assets, thereby getting even richer in the process. While the poor, assetless, ordinary Joe, who can't borrow any money because he's got no assets to his name, sees his livelihood and quality of life eaten up by inflation. And henceforth the saying, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Now, if you're fascinated by this and want to learn more, I'd urge you to go watch this video on YouTube called How the Economic Machine Works. It's written and narrated by a guy called Ray Dalio, who is the hedge fund billionaire founder of Bridgewater Associates. His video really explains the machinations behind the global financial system, and maybe you can even use his information to protect yourself from financial misery. I put the link in the video description below. Now, I'm not saying that central banks are evil or anything like that. Or maybe I am, who knows? But folks really should understand the larger picture about how the global banking system works and how you should sensibly position yourself within its broader context. The higher-ups do not always have your best interests at heart. So beware. Just saying.